This video contains spoilers. Your childhood is a lie, your preconceived notions are wrong, your opinions are invalid, and you should feel stupid for having them. I'll be taking my Reddit awards and comment likes now, please. Cowboy Bebop is a show that countless people have sung the praises of for over 2 decades. It's a show that inspired countless other anime series, helped pioneer the entire seinen subgenre, and cement Shinichiro Watanabe, the show's creator, as being a household name in anime for decades to come. And also, it's not very good. Did I leave my oven on? I think I smell something burnt. About 4 or 5 months ago, depending on when this video comes out, I did an episode about Code Geass where I said this. Old anime like this can tend to go one of 2 ways. They can either be even more amazing than I was expecting, or extremely overrated and a waste of my fucking time. Now, despite me knowing that it was totally possible that saying such things were grounds for the internet to call for my crucifixion, when I said that, my perspective was that it was a little bit of an exaggeration. I mean, at first glance, the show looks amazing. Beautiful art, excellent character design, an OST that helps me finish doing my taxes. But good lord, by the time I reached episode 4, I'd already been subjected to enough poor storytelling that I thought I'd been part of an experiment to see if you can die of boredom. And unfortunately, I'm still here. Right off the bat, I noticed a big reason as to why this was an issue. Now, I know this will come as a surprise to literally nobody who actually watched the show, but Cowboy Bebop is an episodic anime. And because of this episodic format, the show opts for telling stories that are overall inconsequential and have very little impact on the story in any meaningful way. Now, before I start really ripping into this point, I'd like to play devil's advocate for a minute. To be fair, this was the norm for television in 1998 and continued to be up until the introduction of online streaming services. And this was for a legitimate reason. While having to explain this to some people makes me feel like I'm turning into dust with every word that comes out of my mouth, before streaming services existed, you couldn't just binge a series or even choose whatever episode you wanted to watch. And unless you were able to find some kind of weird pirated DVD copy that some dude was selling in the back alley, everything was subject to whatever some TV executive wanted to air at any given time. And also, if you just so happen to be out burning someone's house down, while it aired, you could either A, pay a bunch of money for a DVR and record it to the cable box's hard drive, B, get a VCR or DVD recorder and record it onto some kind of physical media, or C, the more likely option, you were basically fucked. Because of this, TV shows had to find a way to make stories that were self-contained enough that anyone at any time could watch any episode and not be completely lost for details. And it's for that reason that we see Cowboy Bebop having short, self-contained stories that have very little to do with an overarching plot. However, being episodic doesn't mean that you have to forego an overarching storyline. In fact, one of my favorite shows of all time, Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, was an episodic show that was able to implement season-spanning plot lines for the duration of the show. Now, what I think is the real kicker of this point is the fact that you can tell that Cowboy Bebop tried to do that. Some characters and backstories that show up early on are referenced in later episodes. But usually these are poorly fleshed out and contained only within the very few episodes where they're explicitly being explored. And this is made even worse by the fact that the show essentially opts to rely solely on its, admittedly, fantastic aesthetic to keep you entertained, rather than having their attempts at a plotline having any greater effect on the story, thus keeping you invested. If that were enough to keep my attention, then you could make me watch paint dry as long as you slap some kind of cute or cool aesthetic onto something. Oh. And honestly, none of this is to say that a show has to have a serialized plotline in order to be good. Plenty of anime have and continue to have very little character depth and greater storyline and still manage to be extremely interesting and entertaining. However, that would mean that you would have to focus more on the cast's chemistry, interesting concepts, or hell, even just comedy. And like I said before, similar shows like Standalone Complex or Black Lagoon either outright master this formula or at least do a significantly better job than Cowboy Bebop does. For example, my favorite episode in Standalone Complex has our lead character, Bato, having to face his past demons, tracking down an ex-American Special Forces officer that he had a past with, who was known for skinning innocent women alive. And the whole episode surrounds Bato's struggle with his PTSD, and him deciding whether or not to just murder this guy in cold blood, or do his job as a cop and just arrest him. See how interesting that is? That kind of episode is the norm across Standalone Complex, whereas Cowboy Bebop's engaging concepts and execution like this are a very rare exception, not the norm. And for said episodes and concepts like this to be interesting, however, you actually have to have an interesting cast of characters.
This is honestly the root cause of many of this show's problems, and much of what I already said will end up being expanded upon more when talking about this.
Now, I won't say that these characters are 100% uninteresting. However, I will say that if I stood in a pool of them, I wouldn't get my feet wet. You know, they're shallow. There's not much to them.
The show has almost no chemistry between any two characters in the main cast. Now, mind you, part of this is because the show is written in a way that keeps the cast separated for the most part. Most of the time, characters just feel disjointed, and even when they do get together, they act like everything is kept on a decently professional basis. Or, in the case of Faye,
Feed me and tell me I'm pretty!
Which brings me to my next point. Every single member of the cast is a static character. This isn't a bad thing, when the writer intends for this to be the case. Plenty of stories are fine with having a completely static cast. Konosuba, off the top of my head, is a perfect example of a show that's set up for static characters, considering a deep cast was never the point, and instead it focuses more on the comedy and character chemistry.
or hell, for a non-anime related example, how about the original Halo trilogy? The Master Chief and Cortana are static characters without a lot of depth in those games because they're written to fit that dynamic. But yet again, you can clearly tell that this is not what the Cowboy Bebop writing staff wanted. Time and time again, we see attempts to flesh out the main cast and add depth and context to their stories. Spike was a member of a criminal syndicate for a long time, making enemies and allies until finally falling in love with a woman named Julia and deciding to fake his and her own death to finally escape living as an outlaw. Jet was a private investigator with a strong moral compass. At some point along the way, he carried a relationship with a girl named Alyssa until one day she just left him. Further, due to his distaste for the police force's corruption, he resigned and became a bounty hunter, where he would later be confronted with his past. Edward spent some time at a convent and also has a dad.
Ein is a cute little doggo. I don't know what else you were expecting here.
And Faye was cryogenically frozen after sustaining life-threatening injuries during a massive early hyperspace disaster around the year 2014. After she's unfrozen, she's racked with medical debt, gets taken advantage of by her lawyer, and has to adapt to the new world she finds herself in while also trying to somehow find herself due to the amnesia she sustained during the freezing process.
Now, all of this sounds super interesting and gives plenty of opportunity to create deep, dynamic characters that you can get attached to and root for.
But guess what? They didn't. Here's how this is a poopy bad thing.
Every single time we're given an episode looking to enrich the cast with depth, we almost never get any development. Watching Spike run around with his love interest, which, by the way, we know damn near nothing about and assume she was dead for 95% of the series, isn't interesting when it provides no meaningful change in Spike's demeanor. I mean, even looking into the final arc of the show, which is supposed to be Spike's time to shine, there's almost no change in his demeanor at all, even up until the end.
And the same goes for everyone else. Sure, it's interesting that Faye has this super mysterious backstory, and sure, it's cool watching Jet deal with his previous demons to decide what in life is important to him. But at the end of the day, I can't get invested into any of them, because every road bump or revelation leads to absolutely no character growth.
And the very few times we do see a change in a character's demeanor, it's because the writers just needed to have a shift in tone, and we were given absolutely no indication that their personality was ever meant to change. Again, using the example from the final arc, Faye's all sad and crying when Spike's walking off to his death, basically. And up until that point, we're given absolutely no indication that Faye actually gives a shit about whether or not Spike dies. Hell, for the first half of the arc, she was just off doing her own thing, basically left the Bebop. And a big character change like that just kind of came out of left field and then was just never mentioned again. So what we're left with is the main cast that feels like I'm just watching the personification of Ohio. Flat, boring, and repetitive. And none of this actually mentions any of the recurring villains, in which there are very few. If I'm being honest, the only recurring villains that I can actually remember are the ones that are in the syndicate that Spike belonged to. Sephiroth, I mean, Vicious, and...
Truth, mercy, regret. 3 prophet hierarchs.
Yeah, those guys. The Cowboy Bebop wiki page has this entire biography for Vicious explaining his backstory, so I can't tell if I had either just zoned out or the show just explained it very poorly, probably a mixture of both. But while watching the series, all I knew about him was him just being antagonist the character. TM. And yeah, don't expect any explanation about the old dudes either, because you ain't getting any. I think the last gripe that I really have with this show is something that is pervasive during the entire series. The show has a problem with conclusions. Mind you, there are exceptions to this. The episode with Jet dealing with his past was actually completely competent, and the ending was handled pretty well. However, most of the time, the show fails to conclude its episodes in a satisfying way that makes you feel like it was worth your time watching it. Even the episodes I had the most fun with, i.e. the Alien ripoff episode, decided to take a comedic route and end in a way that felt like a slap in the face to me for getting invested.
More pudding. Ow.
Or for further example, how about Edward and Ein just leaving? Like, there was no indication of what she was planning to do. She just outright left. That's it. Goodbye. Have a nice day, I guess.
And before I even hear a word about it, the series ending was executed poorly too. Let's review why.
After breaking into the Syndicate's headquarters and being heavily injured, Spike faces off against Vicious for the last time. What ensues is a small cheesy bit of dialogue between the two, followed by a 1.5-minute long fight scene, where Vicious is shot and killed, and Spike walks about 3 more steps before dying himself. And that was it. The whole bang thing was probably the only cool part. The rest was so rushed that it had me feeling more like...
That's it?
And when you combine the fact that the journey getting to this point was unsatisfying because of the aforementioned static character writing and the killing off of major characters just because it suited the writer's needs, what you're left with is an experience that feels rushed, unsatisfying, and much like the rest of the series, only looks good on the surface.
Now, due to this video just amounting to
I'm done with you, you're such a piece of garbage!
you'd be forgiven to think that I just made it through the series and called it a day. But after the Code Geass video, I quickly realized that my civic duty just wouldn't be done unless I watched all of what the series has to offer. Okay, maybe not all of what the series has to offer. So, I watched the movie, fully expecting it to just be 2 more hours of the same thing that I was subjected to during the entire series. But honestly, it wasn't that bad.
Now granted, I wouldn't outright call it a masterpiece at all, but the movie was overall executed much better. The concept was interesting, being about foiling a chemical terrorist plot created by a botched military project. The character chemistry, pardon my pun, is much better too. Spike and Elektra have a cool dynamic with a slight bit of romantic tension. And the rest of the cast honestly works as supporting characters, but for the way the story was written, it worked totally fine. The main villain is compelling, being a subject of military human experimentation that lost his ability to empathize with humanity. Also, he looks just like Keanu Reeves. The storytelling was handled a hell of a lot better, considering the fact that we get to see the villain being an absolute bastard firsthand. Also, the usual style, aesthetic, and music combined with the prowess of Studio Bones, who took over for Sunrise, and the usual incredible performances by the voice actors, the show looks and sounds better than ever.
All this created a movie that almost made me rethink my experience with the series in its entirety. Almost.
The movie has just one teeny tiny flaw. The movie's ending is even more rushed than the series' ending. Like, seriously, after the incredibly well-crafted fight scene and setup to the final confrontation between Elektra and Vincent, who by the way is the villain's name, I was waiting with bated breath to see how the showdown would end. And then it did, by having Vincent get shot with absolutely no protest or attempt to avoid his fate. And when asked why, he just said now all of a sudden he remembered that he loved Elektra, and then he just died. And that's it! There was no indication that Vincent even had any memory of Elektra, let alone being in love with her. He just made a complete character 180 at the very end. And what's worse is all we get after this scene is Elektra trying to hold back tears in a shot of butterflies flying over the tower they're on. Roll credits! And no, the post-credit sequence did absolutely nothing to further elaborate on what happened. Like, they couldn't even be bothered to just have Vincent make a face that indicates that he changed. That still wouldn't have excused the fact that there was absolutely no indication that Vincent had actually changed, but hell, it would have been better than nothing.
Yet again, the series fails to land the story that it was trying to tell and loses me entirely at the end. And despite handling its characters so much better than the series itself, the movie's failure to land just brings me right back to the same opinion. That the show is just really pretty looking cardboard. You know, despite all my bitching, I do understand why people like the show. For the time that it came out, a lot of the ideas that it presented were pretty revolutionary.
Hell, if Cowboy Bebop didn't exist, then the seinen genre wouldn't exist in nearly the capacity that we know of it today. And on top of that, the show provided a dub experience that was second to none, considering dubs around this time were iffy at best and outright unwatchable at worst. However, I'm also positive that nostalgia has a lot to do with the general love that this show still garners. Honestly, if it wasn't for all the flair and style, then I bet it would have probably been remembered more as either boring, bad, or at the very least didn't age well. And if Cowboy Bebop would have come out today with all the context that we have, it most likely would have been buried in a sea of generally better titles. And you know, if the show could have at least found a better way to end its stories, I would have probably had a better outlook on it. But instead, Cowboy Bebop opts to end its story just as abruptly as I end these videos.
Hey, thanks for watching whatever this was. If you liked it, or even if you hated it, you should be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all the fun YouTube stuff that people tell you to do. I don't know, I'm not your real dad. You do whatever you want. I know I've been mentioning this for like months now, but I'm gonna be moving soon, barring any further complications. My life's a living hell. All going according to plan, this will be the last video that you see this nasty, disgusting background in. So, the reason I do bring that up is it could, maybe possibly, delay the next video. I will be live streaming, starting here pretty soon, actually. I don't have any specific dates yet, of course, with moving, and also my job just getting to be really crazy. I've not really had any time to even breathe. So once things start calming down, probably after I move, then I'll start getting a more set schedule in, and hopefully at that point I'll have a, like, better studio to kinda make look cooler. But yeah, I'll be live streaming both to YouTube and Twitch, so be sure to follow me there at Twitch, links to that in the description. Also join my Discord, because sometimes I like to talk to people. Oh, also, I'll probably be looking into making some in-between videos, something that's like a little bit easier to make, so that this way it's not gonna take me a full month to make that. And I'd like to get that going aside from my normal regular uploads. Anyways, I think that's pretty much all I got for the end of this video. I know I've been talking now for probably the greater part of 20 minutes. Thank you guys so much for watching again, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye. I don't know why I always do this at the end of every video.